Good evening, everybody. What a joyous occasion for me personally, as I was just telling Rajiv, to welcome somebody who's a fellow traveler and somebody whom I have deeply admired, as I was telling him. I've watched many of his programs on Doordarshan. I have seen the wonderful enabling qualities that he had of asking questions in a way that brought out the best in the person who was being interviewed. And so today I thought that we should interview the interviewer himself, who has spent a lifetime of learning from others, asking questions with that wonder in his eyes, with that childlike quality. And then, what he has sourced for all of us through these some amazing people. And I particularly cannot forget the interview that he did of Mr. J.R.D. Tata. And at some point this evening, I would like him to talk about that and also the interviews of his teacher, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the more recent interview that he did when His Holiness had celebrated 50 years of his being in this country as a refugee. And that was a classic interview. So, Rajiv, thank you very much for giving us this gift of your time this evening.
Gosh, thank you, Anil. I'm deeply honored. I have plenty of time, and I'm terrified that I will have to answer questions.
I think my favorite question that I always start this digital conversation with is, Rajiv, when you look back at this wonderful life that you have been given and all the amazing things that have happened in your life, what are some of the moments that stand out in your life which you would describe as defining moments, and also moments in which you were at your happiest best?
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I think that I've been extremely blessed and privileged to have been given this life. I certainly haven't earned it. I mean, that becomes very evident to me as I look back. I have been deeply blessed well, you're blessed by blessings of a whole range of people, from my school principal to my teachers to my the many wonderful people I met during my career on television and thereafter. And I must acknowledge sort of three teachers who have been the decisive influence in my life. I received Diksha from Swami Ranganathananda, the Ramakrishna Mission, so that's a very important aspect of my life. From B.K.S. Iyengar ji, the yoga teacher, from Baba Amte, and of course His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's my root guru, and to my wife and partner Meenakshi Gopinath, and to my parents. So, I mean, I don't want this to sound like sort of a gratitude lineup, but it really is. And I think it's the interactions and learning from these individuals that have been very, very nurturing and empowering and have shaped my life. And I'm nervous about the notion of happiness. For me, it feels more like when I've experienced flow, and when I describe myself, and I am really a struggling aspirant, as miles and miles and miles to go, and I've not really had an ecstatic peak experience that would say that has been transforming. This happened and that changed my life. I've been in terms of my own evolution and growth. There have been coincidences, serendipity, and that's different to this peak moment that I think many people have experienced, and I haven't. But I mean, in some ways, I think I'm dodging your question because there have been many such. So I'm just trying to think of what I would call a particularly significant moment. And of course, that has to be, next to meeting my wife, or perhaps ahead of that, is my meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the impact he's had on my life. And I have felt that this is a connection that goes back for several lifetimes. And I think that sort of, one of the incidents that happened was that, I was traveling with Meenakshi in Tibet. And soon after it had opened up. And, it was one of those sort of standard form guided tours that happen with the Chinese guide who wouldn't let you sort of, move or look left or look right. And we were going around a hillock, and I suddenly felt this very strong urge of belonging, that I belonged here, that there was a connection. So we stopped this moving car. We tried to stop the moving car. It didn't stop, so I flung the door open and I just sort of ran out. And with this guy chasing me, I climbed up the hillock, and there it was. There was this monastery, and I seemed to know my way around it. And when Meenakshi and the guide sort of managed to clamber up to where I was able to give them a guided tour where what was. So
Wow.
that's the kind of serendipity there.
Wow.
That said something to me, that there was something beyond the obvious, and a subtle dimension of life that had a concrete correlative. So it wasn't just a feeling, but something that had verifiable confirmation. And that sort of helped very powerfully bridge, the subtle with the gross. So, when you meditate or you do practices, sometimes it's subtle, and, there can be a lot of self-deception because you've read about experiences and you want to recreate them, and you want to. So that was a very important moment in my life, reaffirming and reinforcing a journey that I had embarked on.
Tell me more about your first meeting with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and your journey as to how you became his student.
Well, that's some of it is sort of personal and sacred, but I came back from Oxford. I plunged into Oxford at the deep end. I'd done a lot of theatre and the subculture of the 70s. I will not elaborate on it. And so I came back in search of my roots, as it were, back to India to try and find anchorage soon after I'd finished that. And so I ended up in Rishikesh, and the Beatles had just left under the teacher's training program at Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's at Pondicherry. And I wrote up a letter to His Holiness and to say that, look, I'd like to meet you. And there were a series of sort of, almost happening that I almost met him, but didn't. One time he canceled, one other time something happened to me. And I went off to the United States to study at Columbia and to finally find my professional passion, which was filmmaking. And I came back, and I have two very, very dear friends who were, one of them was an IAS officer posted in Manali. And His Holiness, he was, I think, district magistrate or an SDM. And so His Holiness was on a visit to that part of Himachal. And, he and his entourage walked in, and they looked at these two friends of mine and said, "Oh, do you know Rajiv?" And out of the blue. And so they called me up and said, "You must be crazy. This man is asking after you." And he remembered my correspondence with him and trying to reach him. And so I met him in Delhi, and a journey started. And just to give you a sense of, I don't want to sort of appear, or nor am I a very sort of advanced or evolved student, and that's best illustrated by His Holiness's, I think, sort of narratives of me in the public sphere. I remember it was 20 years ago that I'd done a book called The Mind of the Guru, and His Holiness had most generously agreed to release the book. And so this was sort of my big ego moment, that His Holiness was releasing my book at the India Habitat Center, and, friends and family and press. And so he released the book, and then he began to speak. And he said, Rajiv Mehrotra, he's a student of mine. He works very hard. But how much he knows, I don't know. So this was his introduction of me in public.
Yes.
And as recently as December last year, so I'm just giving you the whole span of time, and we were launching a chair foundation that I serve His Holiness through at Goa University. And so once again, I spoke, and he took my hand very warmly. And then he said to the audience, he said, he's been a student of mine for a very long time, but he likes to sleep a lot.
Yes.
So that is the nature of my spiritual journey as assessed by my teacher.
Okay.
Lest I appear pretentious.
Rajiv, I also have met His Holiness, and in his presence, I feel like smiling for no reason. And I think that is probably the impact the spiritual masters have on all of us. So I want to ask you, what are the things you have learned from him and with him? It would be very nice for all of us to learn from what you have learned from him and with him.
Gosh, it's a huge canvas, and I have to say that much of it is extremely sort of internalized and subtle, and an experience which cannot be verbalized because it's non-conceptual. And sort of another sort of incident to narrate this aspect of it. That I've been a student a very long time, and like most people, I'm not most people. I certainly am, grounded in the gross and the material world more than I should be, I would like to be, and so I keep feeling that I'm engaging in all this practice and trying to do things, but nothing is happening. And so about 10 years into my journey, and with him in the 80s, he had a lot more time than he now has. So at one point I said to His Holiness, I said, Your Holiness, I've been practicing, I'm doing all these things, but nothing is happening. And so he didn't say anything. And so some years went by, and I kept pushing. So he said, well, what's the hurry? And so I left it for a while, and then I went back, and I said, it's been 20 years. And he said, well, go and read the 9th chapter of Sachdeva, and I know I'll be here in 2 weeks, and tell me. And I mean, this was a text that is very popular amongst Buddhists, but I had never really been able to understand it. So I read it, and I came back, and he said, well, did you read it? I said, yes. And I was expecting some questions or some, clarifications, and he just left it be and changed the subject. And so it went on. I'll cut the story short. And so finally, about 5 years ago, I said to His Holiness, I said, nothing has happened. So he said, what's the hurry? It takes eons of lifetimes. And that was the message. That we are sort of so much in a hurry in terms of our own journeys that we we keep looking for a quid pro quo, in a sense, that I have put in so many hours of practice, or I have done X, Y, and I should have a measurable, identifiable experience. So the learning was that really that the evolution is so subtle, and then again I pushed, and he said, well, you will never know, and the minute you know, it hasn't happened, and other people may notice, and they may tell you, but they're probably biased. So, I mean, I don't think that needs elaboration, and so this story stuck with me, And I was doing a dialogue with His Holiness and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams at Cambridge University. And so there were these sort of 2 days of very intense conversations. And at the end of it, I narrated this story. And so His Holiness sort of laughed and he said, "You've let out my secret." And then he said, because, if people start believing you, nobody will start the journey.
That's right.
And so that was, that for me was another sort of turning point, learning from His Holiness. And the more sort of the more mundane, observable ones, in a sense, was the fact that here's at 80 years age, he was taking instruction from lamas younger than himself. So there was none of the sort of the ego or the vanity that I am now considered by people as the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, and so my journey is complete and I will now teach. You can ask him a question and he will reflect deeply. And I was watching a talk by Ken Robinson, passed away recently, I believe, of an event that I had attended. And I remember this moment that somebody asked him a complicated question. And he held the moment for a long while. And at the end of it, he just said, "I don't know." Because we feel this great pressure to have an answer for every question that is posed to us. And the ability to let go when the mind couldn't grapple with an answer that he needed to come up with. There's so many aspects that, here is a man who so deeply, fundamentally, and profoundly is inclusive. We had organized, for him, where on this, the anniversary we're talking about, Pray for India, because he wanted to express gratitude to the people of India for 50 years in exile. And so he, visited places of worship and pilgrimage of different traditions. And, Raghu Rai had accompanied us, amongst other people, representatives of other different traditions. He's got some amazing photographs. So here is this photograph of His Holiness with a Ganesh yantra around his neck in the church next to Rashtrapati Bhavan, with a cross hanging on top of it and singing a hymn. And with both these, he went to the Nizamuddin Chisti, not the main dargah, but a quiet place, and did the namaz. And so here we have a preeminent religious leader, not merely willing to sort of acknowledge and celebrate diversity, but to actually engage in the rituals and practices of other traditions. And so he always said that, look, don't convert to Buddhism, but we must learn from each other and assimilate what we can from each other. And that includes, very remarkably, modern science. And so he has these Mind Life, conferences periodically, 2-3 times a year, where there is a very engaged conversation with scientists, and not merely in the sense that we have often done, which is to look at the validation of our ancient traditions and beliefs. And so we thought of this 5,000 years ago, and science is only now saying this. No, it is what can we learn from science, and what can science learn from us? And of course, there have been areas of for want of a better word, synchronicity, validation, where there are very sort of important resonances, say between aspects of quantum theory, of mimicry, where two atoms, a zillion light years apart, will mimic each other identically, and we don't really know why that happens. Or that that the true nature of reality is influenced by the presence of an observer, And that connects with the Buddhist idea of, shunya, and there being no absolute reality. And I was going to pick on this idea that you were talking about the self, and what is the sort of the tagline in a sense to this series of lectures. What is the self? And traditionally we tend to look at the self either as you say it's an illusion, and so don't grasp at it. But I think what we're really saying is that if you get kicked or someone boxes you, the self is very real. You feel the pain. And so we're really looking at relative truth and absolute truth. And I'm not qualified to go very deeply into that. But so what we're really saying is that at a functional level, there is that reality. But at a much larger level, it is dependent on the presence of the observer. And there is a very famous experiment in quantum physics where, the slit experiment, where, a stream of light goes in and the atoms fall in a particular pattern. But the minute you begin to measure it, you put an observer, it changes. And so that forms a very important basis for this coming together and celebrating diversity. So the minute you're able to accept that there isn't a single reality, you shouldn't have a problem with somebody else's experience of reality. Sorry, I could go on, and so I will let you ask the question. I'm getting lost.
No, especially the Heisenberg principle. I think the very process of measuring something. Yeah, so it's the way you look at somebody. I often share with my students that if you look at somebody that the person has potential, then the person begins to behave in different ways.
Not exactly, Anil. I think what we're saying here is the very act of looking, no matter how you look, is going to determine this.
Yes, sure.
And it's not predictable.
Yes, so the witness. Yeah, I think in the Vedantic tradition that we follow, which is also linked to the Buddhists, is that you are the witness. So there is a witness inside you which is watching all this interaction, and the mind is also being observed by the witness, and there is a witness watching also the emotions and the thoughts, and also the witness who is watching the action. So our spiritual teacher, who incidentally was a good friend of His Holiness Swami Chinmayananda, would often tell us that we see the world the way we are, not just the way the world is. So yatha drishti tatha srishti is the famous sentence. So I think in that sense, that because, and I'm trying to translate into the everyday behavioral dimensions that we talk about with our colleagues in industry, and saying, if you think there is an opportunity, the very fact that you look at it like that, if you think there is potential, opportunity manifests. And if you think, like in the COVID crisis now, if you say that the world is full of fright and anxiety and it's the end of the world, then that's the kind of thoughts you source. So it's the way you are, is what I was trying to connect it to. But
there are two dimensions to this.
Yes.
One dimension, of course, is that that in the Vedanta tradition, you assume that the observer is somehow connected to a soul.
Yes.
And that's not how we in Buddhism approach this.
Yes.
There isn't the existence of an entity, or however you want to describe it, as the soul.
Yes.
And the other difference is, and is that, when you talk about, if I look at an opportunity, and if I think about the opportunity will emerge, we would add another layer.
Yes.
And we would say that what is the motivation behind the thought?
Yes.
So if your aspiration is merely that, I would like a large car.
Yes.
But if you feel that if I get a big new car, I can use it to teach and serve and help people or function more efficiently to do good.
Yes.
There is a difference on what drives that aspiration.
Yeah.
And that connects to karma, because again, there is this difference in a sense that we would suggest that the karmic imprints in our consciousness are not formed by actions and or specific, so if you think a good deed, you will generate good karma, but by the motivations behind our actions. And also that the causality isn't one good deed does another, will yield a good result. It is a matrix of causes and conditions and a matrix of imprints of motivations in our consciousness, then sort of, interact with each other and manifest not with any specificity. And, I think the struggle here really, and I just want to share this, is that we are really talking about, sort of another story of His Holiness. And there is a great deal of emphasis in our tradition on death, on meditating on death, the process of dying. So that when it happens, I mean, I'm nowhere near practicing it or achieving it, I hasten to add. So that when you approach that, to the process of dying, you're able to steer your consciousness into another life in a form and manner that you can best teach and serve humanity. So unlike Vedanta, we're not looking at moksha. We're looking at nirvana. So that we're not looking to break out from the cycle of life and death, but to keep coming back into the cycle so that we can manifest compassion and teach and serve humanity. And so hence the Dalai Lama is a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, the highest aspiration for a Buddhist practitioner.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, thank you. And, we often say that your deepest desire that you have is the one which, what you're calling, excuse me, the motivation that behind that. So you're right. I'm going to, because I would love to discuss the teachings of His Holiness perhaps for the rest of the time we have, and yet I'm conscious that in a few minutes I have to encourage the audience to ask you questions. So I'll ask you another question. I'll ask you another question about your interview with J.R.D. Tata. Briefly, you described the other day to me. But I would love to understand, how did that interview happen? What did you learn out of your interaction with J.R.D.? And what do you recall as, and I'm sure it is also connected to what we have just been discussing. So.
Oh, absolutely. And I didn't mention Mr. Tata's name amongst, the core, because I didn't have an extended encounter with him as I did with some of the other people I flagged. Well, here I was doing this program and on television in the early 80s. And I wanted to interview Mr. Tata, and I reached out to his office and they said, no, Mr. Tata doesn't do television interviews, and he very rarely does interviews. So I dashed off a letter to him, and nothing happened for several months. And one day the phone rang, and I picked up the phone, and he said, J.R.D. Tata, is that Rajiv? And obviously I sort of almost yelped with joy, and here was a great man himself. And he said, well, I don't do television interviews, but I've been watching some of your programs. And I think you treat your guests relatively kindly. And so, in that spirit, thank you, Anil, so far at least. You have treated me kindly. Anyway, and so, let's set this up. It's a long story. I will try and abbreviate it. It'll lose some of its magic, but time is short. And so we set up to travel to Bombay and to record the interview. And it was going to, I was going to have to invest in this myself because it was a government production and we weren't traveling out, but it was something I desperately wanted to do. He must have sensed an undercurrent of reluctance at the same. So he called back an hour later and he said, look, I don't want to send you a ticket or do anything because that would be influencing you. But if you come in, there is a guest house and you can stay there. And of course, you can pay for it and what have you. So he just sort of put it so elegantly and as if I would almost be doing him a favor because I'd be staying very close to his house. And somebody, that interview didn't work out when he fell ill and he went off to Switzerland for treatment. And so we lost the trail. Almost 2 years later, the phone rings again and it's J.R.D. Tata. Again, the man himself, no secretary, nobody, no intermediary. And he said, well, you must have lost a lot of money and ticket cancellations the last time it happened. So I am going to come to Delhi and do this interview. And so where is your studio? I said, sir, we don't have a studio. And he said, well, talk to the Taj Mansingh. Maybe they will help you. And so I called up the Taj Mansingh, and sort of very matter-of-factly, they said, well, yes, he comes occasionally. When is he due next? We don't know. He just shows up. So I get a call from Mr. Tata that I will be coming next week on day X. Day X was a Band in Bombay. So he calls me, he said, look, I'm not going to break my commitment. I have checked into a hotel so that I can catch the flight in the morning. And I said, sir, what time will you be arriving and where can I meet you? He said, no, just, come to the hotel at 11 o'clock. I go to the hotel. Nobody in the hotel knows that he's coming or what time he'll arrive. No car has been sent to him. And so we hang around and he arrives in an ambassador car, gets out of the car, picks up his small sort of carry-on, walks into the hotel, goes to the reception desk and checks in. And I need 15 minutes to freshen up. We do the interview. He's, candid, disarming. It's on YouTube for anyone who still wants to watch it. And he said, well, you must be hungry. Can I give you lunch? And so he takes us to lunch and he said, I think the coffee shop offers the best deal in the hotel. As we enter the lift, there's nobody waiting, for JRD to walk into the lift and everybody else is excluded. And he ruffles the hair of a child in the lift. And he says, well, we have to look after our future customers. We have lunch. And no fuss is made over him. Chap comes in, takes an order. He asks for a recommendation. And at the end of it, he says, well, do you think this guy has earned a tip? He takes out cash and he puts in a tip and he signs and he gives me a hug and that's over. And so it was, here was this man, sort of the preeminent industrialist. And it was such an amazing lesson in the way he engaged, not just with me, but the people that he encountered, and through his whole journey, his own staff, and also that obviously they had been trained, not to sort of fuss about him or to be obsequious and stand in a line, sort of a waiting line as he entered and walked in. So I think that we learn, and this is sort of an answer to your earlier question, I think we learn so much from, who people are as human beings than what they say or what they do. Because, I think we've become relatively smart in our ability for the things we say. But, the human being you are is ultimately what manifests and creates a presence in ways that we cannot fathom. I mean, you mentioned that when you were in His Holiness's presence, that you always feel like smiling. But there are people who cry because they feel understood, because of this very powerful sense of empathy, which comes from deep practice. And that practice, as I was pointing out, of Avalokiteshvara and compassion. And so that compassion is not merely a verbal framework. It is experienced. And I'm sorry, this is something I feel passionately, but I'm going to say it because it's one of our aspirations now on behalf of His Holiness, is that he feels that the great strength of our civilizational heritage is method and wisdom. That while the wisdom is taught and we hear, so we can listen to a speaker and be impacted by what they say and believe in it, but unless our deepest reflexive responses are active, are sort of activated, it's meaningless. And that is where the method comes in. And so what we're trying to do at Goa University in in that chair is to try and bring together the method aspect and the wisdom. Because if you only study the wisdom, then I can barely communicate to you what coffee or Coca-Cola tastes like unless you have tasted it. How can I start sharing with you the process of, the refining of sensibility, of the nurturing of compassion, unless you have had at least a flavor of it.
Sure. That's why, in soil, the maximum focus in our curriculum is all about compassion, where students work one day in a week with an NGO and learn the concept of seva and, how to source compassion within themselves. That is perhaps the most important part of our entire educational program. So,
do you know, sorry, Anil,
yes,
is that, compassion is not merely virtue.
yes,
Compassion is not just virtuous because God will be pleased or you will earn merit for your next life or the karmic imprints.
yes,
Compassion has now been, and this is the engagement with science.
yes,
So, the mind-life dialogues with His Holiness.
yes,
And so now we have, Dalai Lama centers at a number of universities in the United States.
yes,
And they have demonstrated that, people like Daniel Goleman, who are talking about emotional intelligence, they're demonstrating that, when you start trying to analyze people who have mental problems or are depressed or are struggling with their minds, there is a great deal of emphasis and repetition of the I, me, mine. So what the nurturing of compassion does is that it makes you outer directed. It softens the self that suffers or that experiences pain. And so, I mean, we often, I mean, when we did moral science in school, it was, oh, that's very good, because, you will be you will earn merit or virtue, you'll be a goody human being. But it's now really being demonstrated that it's not just virtue as a moral principle that you're pursuing, but it's also practical. And it helps you to be compassionate. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No. There are questions from the audience. Monica Tata, who is from Portugal, she asked a question. Dear sir, in your view, the journey that humanity has the opportunity to start. And
sorry, will you have to repeat that? I lost it.
yes. In your view, the journey that humanity has the opportunity to start is in collective consciousness. Is it in collective consciousness or in individual agency?
Well, that in our tradition, we believe in the idea of causality, that everything, the very nature of existence depends on causes and conditions, whether it is the environment at one level, the air we breathe, the food that is produced for us by somebody else. So the guiding principles are interdependence and causality. And this operates at many levels. So there is the micro level, where there is individual agency, and there is the macro level, where we look at issues such as the environment, to which our individual actions also contribute. After all, quantum physics tells us that if a butterfly flaps its wings in the rainforests of Latin America, it can create a storm in Bangladesh. So we know that every action can also have this macro manifestation. So it is the intermingling of both these actions, these causes, that determine the unfolding future. So I think this is a very important principle, because it empowers us at times of crisis not to feel helpless. But it also enables us to recognize that the collective, that becomes an object of our compassion, that the collective is as important as the individual initiatives or things that we do. And that starts right from the very basis of thoughts. I mean, sometimes we may not be able to manifest concrete, decisive action. We may be in different stages of our lives, different physical capacities, professional, financial, and what have you. And so it all starts with thought. And thought then, and not just in a sort of an abstract manner, It starts with intention, motivation, and that's another digression as to why people pray. Prayer is the creation of an intention. So we can begin to impact the larger consciousness through prayer if we're looking for something tangible to do. Again, it is the motivation behind prayer. So if the motivation is compassionate, then obviously it'll have a much more powerful resonance than to say, "Oh, save me from Corona."
Yes, sure. So here is a person who's asking this question, saying, understanding the slit experience and the quantum approach to life, how would it be beneficial to the whole by observing the health emergency of COVID? How would it promote an emergence of awareness and accountability to our interconnectedness to all life?
I'm sorry, I have to confess, I don't entirely understand the question.
It's many words. Okay, let me try to summarize. There are some 5 sentences, but let me summarize. By observing the health emergency in COVID, how would it promote awareness and accountability to our interconnectedness?
It won't. I mean, by merely passively observing, unless it generates some, sort of, how to put it, a compassion about, the suffering that people are going through. And if one is in a position for that compassion to manifest in concrete action, it actually both are as powerful as each other. Now I have a sense of where the idea of observing is coming from, because there is a very powerful, popular tradition of mindfulness, a practice, which really is about bringing to awareness. And that, there are different expressions and manifestations of this. So the one hand you have Mr. Goenka, who's Vipassana, who I was also very, very privileged to meet and engage with, not for very long, but under his guidance to learn a little bit of Vipassana. And I think that there is a difference here, and that again is that if we bring to awareness, it is really to understand the true nature of reality, unobstructed and unfiltered by our thoughts, our prejudices, and our assumptions, and to bring that to reality beyond concept, beyond the conceptual experience of it, to an experiential experience. Maybe I'm playing with words there, but it really means you can observe something, and in the early stages of mindfulness, you're trying to give it a label. And those labels progressively, so you don't say good thought, bad thought, you just say thought. And then when you move from thought, you then just say sensation. And that's what Vipassana is doing in some ways, is that when you're looking at, say, bodily sensations, then you begin to see the connection between thought and emotion and bodily sensation, because the body is the repository in physical form of the mind. And so we know, even you do a lot of theater, and so you know that if you want to portray someone who's depressed, you'll sort of crouch and you'll be like this, and someone is positive, it's that. This is an extreme example of it. So you have traditions of acting, Stanislavski, which really tell you that by adopting the physical posture of people of a certain kind, you can actually, it will facilitate experiencing their mental states. So even in the process of acting, where you want to, communicate mental states through, body and gestures and expressions, so there is a very intimate relationship with that. So it is in that context that we talk about awareness. But purely passive awareness, COVID is going, so many people are dying, how terrible. I didn't know the number of people who died yesterday. Unless it impels a personal impetus to make a difference, or at least feel other people's pain, I think it's useless. I hope I'm making some sense. Please.
Ambujakshan Nair is saying, sir, forgiving oneself is very tough. How do I really let go and move on, sir?
Gosh, I mean, I have to take refuge in his what His Holiness would say. I don't know, but I mean, I really don't know. I don't know from felt experience, but if I were to sort of attempt a response, I think that if we experience that the otherness of the other is softened, or we engage in practices, we have a practice called Tonglin, which is exchanging oneself for others as an exercise towards this. And so I can talk about the method, the formal method, but not the intellectual process. Yes, I have struggled with people who I have experienced for a while as having been not very kind to me. But then I need to, I apply a method. And what is the method? If you believe, and most of us in our culture believe in reincarnation, for example. Now, if you believe in reincarnation, then everybody at some point has been our mother or our brother or a son or friend or what have you, including the person who has harmed me or has been, or who you wish to forgive. And the other method is that you visualize your mother's love, and you begin to experience her presence, her fragrance, the warmth of her touch, of her hug, and you sort of experience that visually, and then you move the mother away and you replace that with someone you're neutral about, and transfer those feelings to the neutral person, and then to the people or the person you would wish to forgive. So that becomes a kind of a transformational process. And if you want to use the intellect, you would have to say that, look, we are all subject to causality and causes and conditions that impact our actions. And if these actions are carrying forward from previous lives, we are not aware of them. And this has just been playing out. So I don't really know, but this has been my experience.
Wonderful. One of our students, Anish Thakru, who, by the way, is a wonderful singer as well. He says, sir, from St. Stephen's and Oxford and then to filmmaking. How did it happen? When did you realize that filmmaking was your calling or your passion, or you wanted to do that?
Well, those times are different. When we were young, we did, 50 years ago, we did what other people, and when I did career counseling in school, the career counselor said I should be a chartered accountant because I was good at maths. And I did very badly in school. In fact, I never got a first division throughout my entire career in any university, in any institution. And theater was really my passion when I was in school. And I didn't have the marks to get into St. Stephen's, but I had theater, and so I got into St. Stephen's. And I didn't have the grades or the marks to get into Oxford. And it so happened that my application, which was rather precocious, because I didn't have the marks, ended up with a tutor for admissions who felt passionately about theater. And so when I ended up at Oxford, I was completely out of my depth academically, but I did a lot of theater, and at a fairly advanced level. And I think that was also the early 1970s. The Race Relations Act had been passed in Britain, and there was great fascination about an Indian director directing Shakespeare. And so I sort of rode on that wave and survived, came back. And in the middle, I have to say that we felt very passionately about a career in theater. And so at St. Stephen's, we had a Shakespeare Society, and if my friend Rajiv Dubey is there, he will know that he was secretary of the Dramatic Society, and I was at the Shakespeare Society. And we did 5-6 plays a year. And we gravitated to someone who was to become an icon, Barry John. And I had the great privilege of being one of the signatories to the setting up of the Theatre Action Group. And soon after St. Stephen's, we dreamt we would be like Shashi Kapoor's father-in-law,
Yes.
and Geoffrey Kendall, and travel with Shakespeareana, which was his group. And so we traveled with Shakespeare, and meanwhile Oxford happened, so I left, but Theatre Action Group continued. And I couldn't make a living out of being in theatre, and gravitated towards film. And the money came, I went on a scholarship, and it happened, and now it's over.
Yes. Arshdeep Bopurai, he says, sir, you talk about celebrating diversity. Being an author and an entrepreneur yourself, could you suggest some practical ways to widen one's perspectives around this field of diversity?
But I'm not really an entrepreneur. I struggle with managing two small not-for-profits with very little infrastructure. And when we say celebrating diversity, it really is this aspect of beginning to see all, in Buddhist terms, all sentient beings, not just human beings, as wanting happiness and to avoid suffering, all of us, no matter what our backgrounds, perspective, or class, and to begin to look both at the commonalities and then also to look at the diversities, because each one of us has a different mental disposition. You might like, I love Golgappas, or I love, whatever else, and I love coffee ice cream. You may love a different kind of food. We have different habits and tastes. It is not identical, because sometimes when you're deeply in love, for example, and you think that the object of your love and desire is the most beautiful in the world. Now that is really a projection that we are making onto someone else, because if that person really intrinsically was so, everyone else would think so. And I think that applies equally in say, religion. So if you think that it's my God, and I don't mean just an explanation, but God, and is all, but not everybody experiences it that way. So if you look right from the food that you eat to the object of desire, of love, to a choice of a car, and then you sort of go up that pyramid, you would find that everybody has a different mental disposition and a certain proclivity, and so you're inclined towards a particular form of worship. Now, within Hinduism itself, there is that recognition. And so, Swami Vivekananda very famously, made 4 categories, and, sort of Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Karma Yoga, which was really to say that you have different mental dispositions, and so you do that kind of worship. So depending on your mental disposition, you will find a particular spiritual journey attractive and suitable for you. And the minute we begin to recognize that, and recognizing that is the celebration. That look, you will have your taste in all dimensions of life. And some of these may have sociological origins. So when Islam was born, for example, the Middle East was at war. So it was practical for the Prophet to urge men to have a number of wives, and so that they could be looked after. Now the challenge arises when we are not able to evolve as social realities change, as our tastes and desires change, that we don't change with them, and there is a mismatch. And then we begin to look at other people and see them as somehow not being worthy of our God's favor. And I think that is the genesis of conflict. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that one of the things His Holiness does do, and it is both out of his seeking the experiential understanding of different traditions, but also to send out a signal that here is a preeminent Buddhist monk who has the confidence and the surrender and the humility to engage in the practices and rituals of all traditions. And that's really the lesson for us. And it's also that, and it's not so unidimensional, because our mental dispositions are like, they're gray. So when you say someone may be a combination of bhakti and karma yogi. So you have people who are working in ISRO who will go and look at an auspicious time that a rocket might be launched, or will go and worship at the temple before it's launched. And so they're able to combine these dimensions because they have different emotional needs that exist simultaneously. They're not rigid compartments. And that recognition is so crucial and important in these fractured times. And I think that's why we're divided, because we just don't see it.
Sure. Devendra, one of our alumni from SOIL, Devendra, who's been working in the pharma industry, he says, what do you remember in your conversation and experience with Baba Amte that really moved you?
Well, I'll tell you a moment that really moved me. And, I did a film on Baba Amte, and which was funded actually by Tata Group. And I came back from the film, and His Holiness said, well, where have you been? And I said, I went to Anandwan, and I had the great blessing of spending time with Baba. And and that was the beginning of a long relationship with Baba Amte. I went back many times, but that's another story for another day. And I told him about it, and he said, I want to meet him. And so his team, and we tried to dissuade him, because, you had to fly to Nagpur, and then it's a long ride to Anandwan, and it was the middle of the summer, and he insisted. And there's no air conditioning at Anandwan, and, electricity was erratic. So we went to Anandwan, and His Holiness, we arrived in Anandwan. And it was such a powerful moment for His Holiness. You went into the cafe in Anandwan, and you know how it is sometimes in, tea stalls and on the highway, you will find, I have a mug here, people will sort of serve you a mug like this with their fingers inside it, 4 glasses, and they'll come and put them on your table. And here were people whose fingers were gnarled by leprosy, who were picking up these glasses and coming and putting it in front of us, including His Holiness. And there was something about the integrity and the spirit of these people that Baba Amte had imbued in them, that without hesitation, without it occurring to anybody, you drank that tea. So the next morning, we woke up, and Baba and His Holiness said that they would, go off on a guided tour, and we should all stay behind. And they came back, and I have never seen His Holiness howl. I've seen him weep because he's overcome with compassion, but both Baba Amte and the Dalai Lama were weeping and howling, and they were hugging each other. And through that, His Holiness said that, look, you practice what I only preach. And that was another very powerful moment of my life. That the candor and the power of 2 men, men of action, concrete empirical action, manifesting compassion, to this degree that you forgot that this guy had leprosy when he put his fingers in the glass. Or you forgot that Baba Amte was planting fruit trees on the bodies of people who had died of leprosy and selling those fruits to the neighboring community which had shunned them. And they were now eating these fruits that had been fed on the decaying body of the people who had leprosy. And then there was His Holiness, through intent and who he was, manifesting and having people laugh or break down and cry because just of who he was. So this, what more can one say in terms of the power of the moment and the power of 2 human beings?
Yeah. Rajiv, it has been very, very special in having you this evening with us. And I want to share what I have learned from you and with you today.
You're very kind, and stay that way as you sum up.
There are several things I learned from you today. One, this compassion is not just something that you think about. It's an experience that you feel, and that is the core of human existence.
Aspiration and hence existence.
The second thing that you really reminded us of, what is the motivation behind even your thought? It's not just important to focus on your thought, but what is the motivation behind that thought? And you give an example that you may be thinking about getting a bigger car, but if the motivation behind that is so that you can use it as a vehicle for serving the well-being of all, and that's why there is a bigger car, it's a very different aspect that we are talking about. You talk to us that about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that it is not merely his teaching, but the way he continuously learns, that there is absolutely no question of any time saying that I have now reached enlightenment. And so learning from much younger lamas at every moment, having the joy, the childlike joy of learning and continuously doing that, and the practice of 5 hours a day. Thank you for sharing that. So it's a continuous life of practice and making that happen. And you know, this whole story that you talked about of J.R.D. Tata and his humility, and how he touched you, not just by what the content of his interview, but just the way he conducted himself, in the deep impact it created in you, that even 50 years later has remained, 30 years later, you think about it, it's a special moment. And thank you for the last moment. I had my eyes for wet to look at the scene of Baba Amte, because we grew up, I was raised in Pune, and, we grew up with the stories about Baba Amte and the leprosy camp, and, and my first job was the Tatas. So that whole compassion personified, compassion in action, and the two teachers being moved. And I think in today's time, in a way, you have given us the answer that in the COVID times, if we can only enable the compassion in our hearts to manifest, and we can feel that, I think that by itself will enable the best in each one of us to emerge. So thank you, Rajiv. Thank you very much for coming this evening. And I want to also honor Rajiv Dubey, a close friend who went with me to Tibet, where we went to Mansarovar and Kailash Yatra together. And I know he's part of this group today listening to you. And there are several friends of yours who are here. I want to thank each one of you for joining this wonderful conversation. And thank you, Rajiv. Thank you for coming today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. Your summary was more eloquent and more revealing to me than what I may have said. Thank you very much. You were wonderful.
Thank you very much.